Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Velero community meeting for September 7th, 2028. 2021, not 28. We're not that far into the future. We don't have flying cars yet. All right, we're going to go through some status updates, and then we'll see if we have some discussion topics. If people are joining today, we move those items up. So first up, we have Bridget.
Hi, everyone. So since our last meeting, my focus has mainly just been trying to close things out for the 1.7 release, which we're hoping to do get a release candidate out today, although an issue has come up which I'd like to discuss to see whether that will impact that release candidate, but we can discuss that afterwards. Yeah, I just put in a link to things that I fixed or am either currently investigating. Yeah, so this particular issue was we were backing up downward API volumes with Rustic, and this exposes the same issue that we saw with backing up and restoring the projected volumes. So I've just added essentially the same fix, which is to skip their backup and then also prevent them from being restored if they exist in a previous backup. So that will go into 1.7. Yeah. Just looking at the participants, I don't know if we want to chat about this now. I plan to put this in like a discussion topic, but since it's only the five of us and Raphael and Fong aren't here, so maybe we can jump into the discussion of this now.
Well, why don't we hold it and see if anybody else shows up? They may just be late.
Yeah. So this is something I'm currently working on. We'll chat about it in discussion topics. That's it for me.
Okay. As Bridget mentioned, we're rolling towards RC1 for 1.7, and it had passed all of the automated tests on AWS and vSphere. So we're starting to move forward with the manual testing. One question we were going to moot was, with maintainers, is what availability they had to take on any of the testing, additional platforms or stuff like that. You can bring that up later on. Let's see, item snapshotter, pushing the PR towards actually being ready, but we won't merge that until 1.8. So no rush, but probably do a discussion on that next week. And then I had community support. And there wasn't anything too weird this week. So that's it for me.
Sounds good. Thank you, Dave. Does anyone have anything else they want to share about what they've been working on? Eleanor, Scott?
I know I've kept talking about this, but my plan is my plan is next week to have a 1.8 potential roadmap to show and get feedback on. And I'll do my best even to try to send it out before. I'll work on it this week.
Sounds great. Thank you, Eleanor. All right. Since Raphael isn't here or Fong, and we're going to punt 4080 as well until next week. Dave, did you want to discuss 3708?
Yeah, and actually I was going to toss a couple things out there for the plug-in hooks just for initial discussion. So this is adding like a pre and post restore hooks that could happen for the whole backup. And I'm considering asking that this be something a little more generalized so that we could add pre and post hooks on different types of objects, not just the cluster itself, but maybe like as we hit a namespace or something. So any thoughts on that from anybody? Okay, I'll boot that around with Raphael. Scott, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna, if we're ready to the next issue, I know you pointed out that I had that PR out there to deal with the namespace remapping on PVs. And basically, the background for this is a couple things. First of all, we're already doing this if there's a snapshot. So if you change namespace on your restore and there's a snapshot for the PV, then we're updating the reference to the PVC. And we ran into an issue with this. One of our migration use cases is something that we call a PV move, where we're not doing a snapshot or a restic backup. We're just backing up the Kubernetes resource for the PV and PVC, and then restoring it to a different cluster. And the main use case for this is as an external NFS volume, with the idea being that we have an NFS server outside the cluster, and we want to migrate an application that mounts that to another cluster. So in that case, when we're not changing namespaces, everything works fine. We just back up, do a normal backup of PV and PVC, we do a normal restore, and obviously we shut down the application that's mounting that in the source cluster. And then in the destination new cluster, we're pointing to that same external NFS share. When we try the same use case, but change the namespace in the new cluster. So instead of going to the same name and namespace in the new cluster as it was in the old cluster, we use the namespace remapping feature on restore. In that case, it fails because we're not updating that claim reference namespace. So in the destination cluster, the PVC shows up as pending because it says the PV is already in use by another PVC. Of course, it's not. The reason is because the name the matching doesn't match up, because it sees the same name, but the namespaces are different. So this PR basically makes the namespace renapping restore work the same way as a same namespace restore. And
yes, but not quite. So, like we talked about the snapshot case. In the snapshot case, you're actually creating a new volume and then remapping the PV to it, so it doesn't share anything.
Okay, right.
Mhm.
And I guess what I'm wondering is, it seems like, and I understand the risks. The risks here would be, you know, if you're restoring a PV and that's already in use, you know, already, then you're going to have two things pointing to the same place. If the concern is pointing, you know, the actual underlying volume, for example, this external NFS volume, I wonder though, do we have the same problem even when you don't change the namespace? If I restore a PV and a PVC, and we restore that PV that points to that external NFS share, there's nothing guaranteeing that the other cluster I backed it up from isn't still live and pointing there.
That's true. Though we expect that the storage system, if it's going to enforce anything, will keep you from doing multiple attach. So that's kind of a basic issue that we already have, but we think this is covered. But what Bridget ran into, you know, because we were looking through this, we're like, hey, this doesn't, you know, change the volume handle. What's going to happen? And so Bridget tried it.
Yeah.
And like even with read write once volumes, if it winds up on the same worker node, it shares the directory, and that's really not expected behavior.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was trying this out with like the case where you might do a backup and remap into a different namespace, but you still have the existing workload that's still there. So all of a sudden now you have two PVs, but they point to the same storage, but with like two workloads that essentially could be writing to it.
Yeah. And I guess the issue is that if the cluster you're restoring to is the same as you're backing up from, this is only a concern in this remapping case, because in the case where you're not remapping, it's already there. And maybe my point that I was making on the PR was that some of this risk already exists, even if you're not remapping namespaces, if you're restoring to a different cluster, because you could have two different applications pointing to the same underlying storage in different clusters. So I guess the question is, you know, if those, but it may be that in the cross cluster case, that's less of a concern because you have to be more deliberate about doing that kind of thing. And
well, I think there's two cases. I mean, one is like read write once volumes. For the most part, the storage system doesn't let you do multiple attach. So like EBS, I don't think allows multiple attach. So you're gonna get an error.
Yeah. Well, it depends on that depends on whether it's on the same node or not. Although we've actually run across
the two different clusters, right? So they shouldn't be sharing nodes.
Right. Exactly. So they won't. So So yeah, if it's an EBS volume, because they're different nodes, yeah, that would air out on you. If it's an NFS volume or something like that, then you're not going to have a storage provider that's managing this for you. So it'll just exceed, and you're going to have your application issues.
Yeah, it seems like this one though. I mean, it's explicitly checking for the case the PV already exists, so it's almost creating a situation.
I guess in the same, and I guess that's where this is an issue, right? If you're restoring to the same cluster as before, then you really are potentially creating this situation. I'm not sure what the answer, I guess, is there, because I'm just trying to think about, here's a case where if we do this restore to a different cluster and we keep the namespace the same, everything works fine for this kind of quote PV move use case, because Velero just lets it happen. And because from Valero's point of view, it has no way of knowing whether this is a disaster recovery situation and the PV and PVC are gone, or or in this case, it's a different cluster. But in the change namespace case, I guess the concern there is, I don't know if there's a way for Velero to check to say if the PV that it could, in other words, the risk here is we're changing the reference to point to something different, so that if the original PV is already there, then you hit this kind of two PVCs or two PVs pointing to the same volume situation. Would it make sense for Velero to check and only remap this if the PV it's pointing would otherwise point to doesn't exist? I don't know if that's too much checking to do there.
Well, I mean, it seems like a reasonable check. I mean, that would that cover your case?
It should cover our, well, it would, I think it would cover our case in general. I mean, obviously it would fail in kind of sporadic ways, because in other words, if cluster A, had basically, if you're migrating an application to cluster B, and you're changing namespace because the namespace you were using is in use, it's possible that there is the same name in use by a completely unrelated PVC. If I migrate an application, but some different version of that same application is in the same namespace, and that's why I'm remapping namespaces, it could fail in those cases. But in the general case of, I'm just creating this in a new cluster and I want a different namespace, but there's no contention, then this would narrow the number of failure situations for us, I guess. In other words, if we allow this remapping to work, but only if the thing we're mapping away from doesn't exist in the cluster.
Yeah, I mean, I would err on the side of failures, explicit failures versus silent corruption.
Right.
Because I'd much rather see that my restore failed and go and debug it rather than, start overriding my data by accident.
Yeah, exactly. So I guess if you want to think about the kind of different scenarios, what's happening before this PR is basically it always fails whether or not there's a contention. Anytime you do a change namespace with this PV move use case, it's going to fail. It sounds like the concern is with the PR as written, it's going to apparently succeed in all cases, but there might be rare situations, or maybe not so rare. That's the question, where there's data corruption, and then that's the thing we have to avoid. So there may be a solution in between here, which instead of just blindly changing the reference, we do a check to see, does the thing that we're changing away from exist already in the cluster? If it does, then we don't change it. And if it doesn't exist, then there's no contention in this cluster, so we go ahead and change it.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable sanity check. I mean, there's still cases you can construct, but you kind of have to work constructing them.
Yeah. Well,
if somebody restored with the remap once and then restores into a different namespace, it's like, well,
right.
You see what I'm saying? It's like,
I see what you mean. You're right. Because in other words, if the original doesn't exist, but you restore into namespace 2 and then into namespace 3, that's.
But you're kind of asking for it at that point,
Yeah, and the only way around, and well, the other point here is that if you're doing, at that level, any restore of a PV and a PVC could potentially,
That's true.
I created a PV that pointed to this EVS volume, and I created another one that pointed to this EVS, at that level, unless you want to examine every PV in the cluster and, compare. I think that kind of basic sanity checking would at least kind of handle the normal, the default case of I back up in this cluster, I restore in this cluster to a different namespace, not realizing that I have volumes here that are going to be, stepping on each other. I think that's the case we're concerned about here, is the case where you're restoring to the same cluster and you're changing the namespace, and your new PVCs and your new namespace and your old PVCs and your old namespace are pointing to the same underlying volumes and stepping on each other in ways that if you're not using something like EBS, you won't know about, and you'll just, you'll have the same kind of failure you'd have if you, mounted your NFS shares incorrectly in too many places or whatever.
Mhm.
So checking for that before doing this remapping ought to prevent that problem. And I think any of these more obscure, kind of harder to come up with failure cases are probably ones we're already running the risk of anyway with any restore of a PV that's not from a snapshot or rustic.
Yeah, there's definitely, there's ways to cut your fingers off with the static provisioning.
Yeah, I think we just so one thing that came up as we were looking at this was just the idea of folks who are maybe just like trying Velero out and maybe take a backup, and then they're like, I'll just restore it and do a remap just to see
right.
Did it work before they commit to it, and then in doing that process they end up doing something.
Yeah. That does make sense actually. Yeah, because that's one of these cases where, again, the basics, when you're just trying it out, you're sort of minimizing the things you're doing, and so you're probably not configuring rustic. You're probably not doing snapshots. You may or may not even know you have volumes in that your namespace you're testing, and then you're going to restore to the same cluster, and that's the kind of combination where this change here would probably be risky. That makes sense, I guess. And then I think if I got to go back and look at the PR again to refresh my memory how I did it, but I think if we can just look in the cluster to say, before we change this, is it currently pointing to an actual valid PVC? And if it is, then we don't change it, because that's pointing to the same place. If it's not pointing to an existing PVC, then I think in that same cluster use case, it's probably reasonably sure that you're not stepping on yourself somehow. And I think the only easy way to fail that check would be to take the same backup and restore, or to take two backups of the same namespace after deleting the original namespace and restore them to two different namespaces. I mean, that would still be risky. I don't know whether that's a use case that is common or that we need to worry about it, or if that's one of.
It seems like, it's like the only other option would be to really search for everything and make sure there's no matches, which is really hard.
Yeah. Or to refuse to do it in the first place, and then which, obviously from our point of view doesn't, that means we don't enable this particular use case of restoring to a different cluster and changing the namespace and pointing to the same external storage. I mean, we're only really doing this for NFS for the most part, because of the, the EBS concern. For EBS, we're going to do snapshots, or we're going to do rustic or that kind of thing anyway. The main use case for this is NFS, where you're saying, hey, this is external to cluster. I'm just migrating and I'm not doing a backup, for backup purposes. There's no need to copy all this data. And that's the use case where we're doing this, PVC move.
Yeah, I mean, we've had the same request, because like migrating across vSphere, being able to do this upgrade from one version of like TKGI to TKGM without copying the data. We've had the request to do this. And we could add a flag to say -- migrate or something like that, or adopt existing.
Yeah.
But I hesitate to add yet another flag.
Yeah, it's right now, we've kind of just relied on the fact that Velero, if it tries to do a, if it tries to do a snapshot and it can't, because either it's not a snapshotable system or it doesn't have a volume snapshot location, then it just defaults to copying, backing up and restoring the PV definition. And so, and in fact, that ABS use case, when we try to move, if we happen to configure a volume snapshot location, we end up doing a snapshot copy anyway, because there's no way to tell Velero, hey, don't do a snapshot, because if there's a volume snapshot location, it'll use it and create a snapshot. So, and that's something that we may want to look in at some point to sort of explicitly enable that, but at this point, that really hasn't been a priority. So the use case that I'm envisioning with this PR really is mainly for NFS and other kind of static storage situations where we can't do a snapshot anyway, and where we don't want to do restic because we don't need to go through that overhead.
Mm-hmm. I think I'm good with if we add the check, at least, make sure that there's no same named PV that we're running into.
Got it.
I mean, the other thing we could do, which I hesitate, would be to check and see like if it's read, write, and many, and go ahead with that. But I think that introduces a little too much, like, if it's Wednesday, this thing works. If it's Tuesday.
Yeah. I think that I guess the other thing is that in the case that Bridget saw where this was causing problems, was that a case where the PV, because in this case, when you're restoring the PV and the PVC, you're restoring the PV as is with its name. So if that PV was already there, wouldn't it fail to restore anyway?
So part of the so I think one of the checks that it does is that I think there's like a check to see if the PV already exists, and if it does, it gives it a new name. So it renames.
Oh, that's right. Oh, yeah. Oh, no, you're right. That's right.
Yeah.
Which again is something you want in the case where you're doing a snapshot, for example, because I got it. Okay. So that, I guess that's another possibility, is maybe we update the PVC mapping, but we don't offer to rename the PV. I don't know if that would solve this in a simpler way, because it still doesn't prevent against some other. I'm just thinking if you're restoring this PV-PVC combination and you change the namespace, because there's two things that this does, and I was kind of trying to follow what was done in the snapshot case. One is if the PV exists with that name, we give it a different name, and the other is the PVC mapping reference in the PV spec we update to point to the new namespace. Mm-hmm. I wonder if instead of checking things, what if we don't do the PV renaming part, but just update the PVC mapping? Because in the case where you're doing a backup and then doing an immediate restore to a new namespace, that PV will exist. So then it just wouldn't restore. It would be the usual Velero behavior there, like we're seeing now. So then the only thing this PV, if we did that, we limited the scope of this PR to just updating that PVC claim reference. I
think that should get Kubernetes to error out then if it's already attached. So that's probably good.
Right. Either error out or we would get Velero to put that message in the log saying, hey, because when Velero comes to restore, you get the already exists error, and then you say, hey, you check to see it's different, and then you get the log message saying, PV already exists in the cluster and it's different from the backed up version, and that's just the Velero warning saying we're not doing anything with it. So in that case, we're not creating a second PV if one already exists. But if it doesn't exist, we're updating the PVC names remapping. So that way, so again, the use case here is I do a backup of a namespace with the PV and PVC, whether it's to a new cluster or the same cluster after deleting that PV and PVC. The PV doesn't exist, and I restore to a new namespace. It'll work, and it'll update that PV PVC reference so that works. But if I try to remap it on restore without deleting the original, then the PV won't get created in the first place.
Yeah, I think this is good because it also deals with the other case, which is you restore it into namespace X1 and X2.
Yeah.
And they'll both still be pointing at the PV, same PV. So
Right.
you won't be able to
So,
run
so
into
both of them will
yourself there.
fail.
Or
Yeah.
Yeah,
Or
the first one
or
will
again, the
succeed.
case where, because the case where the check would fail would be if I do a backup and then delete everything, I then restore to namespace 2, and then I restore to namespace 3.
Right.
That's first restore would succeed with this modified limited PR, and then the second one would fail because again that PV now exists. So
yeah, and so that's good behavior, right?
yeah, I think this. The funny thing is, I think the first iteration of this, when I was testing this out, was just a namespace, and then I was comparing it to the PV behavior. I'm like, wait a minute, we're doing this. If it exists, I should do the same thing. It's consistent this way. And that's where we introduced the problem.
I mean, it made sense. I mean, we're reading the code. It's like, oh, this is simple. Let's just merge it.
Yeah. Well, and the only reason we didn't merge it was I think Nolan had suggested a few months ago, hey, let's refactor this so that we're not running the same code in 2 blocks.
Yes, I think that's.
And then it got put on hold because no one reviewed it, and then I wasn't focusing on it, and but I think at this point, backing up from that, it's now not the same code because we're doing a smaller set of changes now. I think we want to go ahead and update that namespace mapping, because telling a PV, hey, your PVC is this, not that, seems like a relatively low risk behavior because you're just restoring, the PV is going to restore anyway. And it's now pointing to the PVC that you restored rather than to some non-existent PVC, or to some existing PVC that's pointing elsewhere anyway. And that's not, because you're restoring the PV and the PVC together, they're now pointing to each other together as you expect them to. But if we don't do the rename of the PV, I think we remove the possibility of creating that 2 PVs pointing to the same place in the same cluster problem. So instead of adding new checks to this PR, I think the answer is to just remove about half of the functionality. And so instead of doing both the PV rename and the update the PVC reference, let's just update the PVC reference. Let's not do the PV rename. And that should be and that's the only part that really that's the part that my use case needed. I was just trying to be more complete with this and realizing it just did the wrong thing there. So, okay.
Okay, well, that sounds really good. I think that's good.
Yeah, I'll revise the PR probably sometime this week to remove some of that, and then hopefully we can go from there.
Yeah, we'll kick it in for 1.8. So we're going to go into code
that's fine.
2.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, and this is one of those too that the version in place in this PR, because we were hitting bugs with it, I ended up, and the fork that we used for our builds, I already included it. But again, for the migration use case, this bug is not a concern. But once we upgrade to 1.8, I can abandon this local commit and just use the upstream version of that, and then that goes away. So getting it in for 1.8 fixes the problem upstream, and at the same time, we're not waiting on it for release because we've got this somewhat flawed version, but isn't flawed in our use case. Right. So, but yeah, okay. I'll get that updated. So yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, that sounds good. Thanks.
Yep.
And then Bridget, you wanted to talk about that other issue?
Yeah. If everyone's okay for us to dive into this, just because I started to look at this and realize that it is affecting like 122 like backups. So I just wanted to see if this is something that we need to potentially try and get in for 1.7, just because I think it might trip up a few people. I'm still trying to like understand it. But basically the issue is that there are folks who had V1 beta 1 CRDs in their cluster. They've gone through like an upgrade process to use the V1 version of the CRD, but they have essentially now, because they've done this upgrade to V1, there are fields in the CRD which were removed in V1, which mean that the CRDs that they have in their cluster now aren't valid. But when Velero is doing a backup, it checks for these fields to try and determine, it checks for that field to say, oh, this is a V1 beta 1 CRD. I should back it up using this version of the client. But then because they've gone through this process and they've upgraded their clusters to 122, the V1 beta 1 API doesn't exist. So there's some conflict there.
I think you lost me a couple
I'm
times ago.
confused myself. Yeah, it's
So,
because
so we've
yeah.
got
So can
we've
we
got
like open
existing
up
CRD.
the issue?
Yeah.
I don't know if Jonas is still with us.
I'm here. What do you need?
Hello. Could you open up the 4080 issue that's linked in the HackMD? And then if you just like scroll down to the very bottom to like the very last comment, just so we can like look at one of these CRDs. Actually, if you
Wait,
go
why don't
down
we
to the
why don't we let Bridget share?
yes, I will share. Yeah, that would be easier. Thank you.
Sure thing.
Okay.
Remote controlling me sharing my
Yes.
screen is a bit hard. So yeah, go for
Yeah.
Yeah, the APIs are cumbersome.
it. And I'm a bit slow.
Okay, there we go. Can everyone see my screen? I'm just gonna make it bigger. Okay, so the issue that we have is that we have a so they are trying to do a backup on V122, so Kubernetes 122, and they're getting an error because Velero is attempting to use the V1 Beta 1 CRD API to back up their CRDs.
Okay.
But this API no longer exists on Kubernetes 122. It's been removed now. So this person pointed out that Velero does some magic to detect whether it should use the V1 Beta 1 API or the V1 API when backing up the CRDs. And some of the things that it checks for are things like, does it have this preserve unknown fields field set? Does it have a non-structural schema? Does it have a single version? Basically, I think it's this one. This is being triggered because
So basically they had a V1 Beta 1 CRD.
they
So
upgraded it. Yeah.
But the old fields remain in the CRD.
Yes. But Kubernetes itself is also saying that although they have the CRD in their cluster, it's invalid. So if you look at the status, so here's they gave an example of one of their CRDs. So it has this non-structural schema validate
So
is
okay,
failing.
so if we were able to, so let's say we simply use the V1 APIs, would that be able to read this?
I'm not sure because I think it would potentially fail because there's another field in here that might get like taken out. I'm not sure.
No, what I'm thinking is, I mean, so one possibility is we could fall back if the V1 Beta 1 API fails. You say, okay, fine, I'll use V1.
Yeah.
Which might not be bad, but then if this is going, so if this is going to fail anyway on either backup or restore, I'm not sure there's, a point to doing too much more work other than simply logging like this CRD is invalid and moving on.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, like this is just like I put this out just because I wasn't really sure what we should be doing. So one of my thoughts was, it was like we could potentially check for the status here, and if any of these like if there's some reason why we can detect that the CRD is invalid, then we'd be like, okay, this is an invalid CRD, we're going to skip it. But then that might like sting some people later. I don't, or whether we like try and use the V1 API in that situation. Like I guess maybe the thing that I'm not sure of is this something that the user should be responsible for making sure that like all the resources that they're trying to back up are valid according to like the Kubernetes API server?
It depends on what this error is actually going to cause. Is it going to cause Kubernetes to ignore this, or is it just put out an error?
I don't know what will happen. This is the thing. Like I only started looking at this like.
I think that's reasonable. So I think one, if we can back it up using the V1 APIs and restore it, and it goes back to at least its original broken state, we're probably good. You
Mhm.
know, that would probably be a good thing to do. So if we like in the code, if we get an error back like the v1 beta 1 API doesn't exist, we say, okay, fine, then we'll flip off that flag and we'll just move forward with using the v1 API.
Mhm. Yeah.
Actually,
So I
it does
guess
bring up a question on restore. If we're restoring a v1 beta 1 CRD, but the
it'll just
Yeah,
it'll
if you
fail.
try if you take a V1 beta 1 CRD and try to restore it in a 122 cluster, that'll fail because we actually hit situations from that too. Because one of the things, you know, because if you back up a namespace and it pulls in, you know, CRDs for your custom resources in its backup. So if you're on a, you know, Kubernetes, you know, 112 cluster and you do a backup, when you restore that CRD, it's going to fail unless you create the CRD before, you know. I mean, one situation, and this is, you know, in fact, I've been trying to fix a bug in our migration product for that purpose, to basically warn the user ahead of time to say, hey, you know, your CRD versions between source and destination cluster are completely incompatible, because, you know, you have v1 beta 1 on source and you don't have it on destination, and then letting them know, hey, you have these CRDs that are involved in your namespaces. You need to create those ahead of time before you restore to those clusters, because the backup will include the CRD. If you try to restore that, it'll show up as restore error. But of course, if the CRD already exists in the cluster, it'll just be the standard Velero, again, the warning like we were talking about before,
Mhm.
this thing exists in the cluster already.
Mhm.
So I just know that from working on that bug that, yes, if you have a backup with a v1 beta 1 CRD in it, when you try to restore that to a 122 cluster, that resource will not restore, because that, you know, API version doesn't exist in the cluster.
Can we try this just as a simple test? So we've got like the whole YAML for their CRD. If we just do a kubectl apply of this, what happens?
I think it will fail because this field, this preserve unknown field, is invalid. So I think it'll fail the kubectl validation before it
Okay,
even applies it.
so I would give that a shot, but I mean, basically it sounds like there's no way for us to fix this, right? Because even if we use the v1 API to read it, it may not read, and it almost certainly won't restore.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think we have, I'm trying to think, we have like some other action that takes place like elsewhere in the cluster that like does a remapping of the CRD versions. I'll take a look and see what it's doing to see if there's like some case that it could be catching. But yeah, I'm like, I think like there is potential for, yeah, for us to, if we try and back it up using a v1 and then we end up breaking it on
Yeah,
restore.
because it sounds like what we're doing right now is we grab it as an unstructured and then walk across looking for these magic fields.
Yep.
Which, you know, is good, but it doesn't mean that we can, you know, all this is doing is it's pointing us to using the beta 1 API versus the v1 API.
Mhm.
And I don't think we want to change things so that we always grab the unstructured and mess with it.
Yeah. Okay. So do you think we should still try to investigate? Maybe I'll like take the steps to investigate the behavior and see what does
So
happen.
I would see if you can apply it using kubectl.
Mhm.
And if that simply fails, then it's not going to restore no matter what we do, right?
Yeah.
And if we can't restore it, there's no point in, you know, backing it up and saying we backed it up.
Yeah.
We should, you know, just go ahead and take the error message. It's like, yeah,
Yeah.
maybe you should fix your CRDs.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe, yeah, we could probably put something a little bit more verbose in the logging just to kind of indicate like what's going on, because there's something
Yeah.
like, I'm going to attempt to back this up as v1 beta 1, and maybe like just expand on that a little bit to say, because this particular state about the CRD is true. Okay.
Yeah, that sounds pretty reasonable.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. But I don't. Yes, I wasn't really sure if this is something that we would want to try and fix for 1.7. I'll take a quick look at it this afternoon. But I don't think there's a reason to hold off the release for something like this.
Yeah, I think the first question would be, is it fixable?
Mhm.
You know, versus making it nicer. Because I don't disagree, making a better error message would be good, but it doesn't actually fix anything.
No. Oh, this stuff is so complicated. It confuses me so much because it's like API versions that are like separate from like cluster versions and
Yeah, and then you got like the transport mechanism is versioned as well. It's like, oh.
Yeah.
Oh well.
But then also the CRDs themselves represent versioned items. Because it's like, which versions of this particular like schema are you essentially representing? Anyway, okay, cool. Thank you very much. I just continue to be confused by this stuff.
Join the club.
Even though I have nothing to contribute, thank you for working on it. I will just add moral support.
Thank you.
So I had a quick question since we're talking about 1.7 and CRDs. I know when we came up with the plan to release 1.6.3 with the V1 version of the Velero CRDs, we had said tentatively at that point that for 1.7 we were probably going to drop the V1 beta 1 support going forward. Is that not the case? That we're going to keep those at this point?
I don't think anybody's figured out how to undo it. So
okay, so 1.7 will also support the V1 beta 1. So our minimum support version is still, I think, 1.12.
Yeah.
Okay, got it. Okay.
Okay, well, I think that's it. Anything else on the agenda, Jonas?
That's it right now. Unfortunately, I didn't capture the contributor shout out, so I'll do that next week.
Okay, sounds good.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Yep. Bye.
Later.
Bye.